So let me just start my presentation. I'm using, like I said, an iPad with a unique app here called Perspective. So yes, I've been asked to talk about the future of mobile, and I think the way to start talking about the future of mobile is to talk about the history of mobile. And of course, the history of mobile is the history of computing itself. And computing has changed dramatically, as we can all attest from our own careers. And I'm going to begin this expose with what I call a brief history of computing. Now, this app allows me to zoom in a little bit and show you some of the details here, so bear with me while I practice this. Basically, what we have on this graph is the number of units of computers sold in a particular year. So you see year 1977 here, and the beginning in thousands, and that's 10,000 units. But when I zoom back out, you'll notice that this is actually a log scale. So the top number here is 100,000 units. So we're dealing with, oops. Let me start that again. So we're dealing with a log scale. So 1975, 1970, up until the 1980s, this is what the PC market looked like. And there were several players who were selling in the million units per year on that basis in 1983, for example. So we had the Atari Computer Company. We had Apple with the Apple II, and the PC only just started in 1981 with 240,000, and by 1982, 240,000 units were selling. Now, what happened is already by 1984, some of these early incumbents were beginning to decline. The TRS-80 computer, for example, was already coming down, and Atari's first generation, as you can see here, in gray, is coming down as well. But the PC was doing well. In fact, however, it wasn't the number one computer platform at the time. There's Commodore in the background over here, as you can see, outselling the PC in 1984. And 1984 is, of course, the year when the Macintosh came out. And when it did, there you can see it launching with 372,000 units, but going straight down. In the second year, selling only 200,000 units, it was indeed a big flop and a big embarrassment for Steve Jobs, actually, which caused him later on to leave the company. And PC was, for the first time, number one computer. Actually, in fact, my first PC I bought in 1985. Actually, my parents bought it, but anyway, it was mine. And I learned to program on it. So, and then came some follow-up products like the Atari, the second generation Atari ST, and then we had the Amiga computer platform, and the Macintosh began to pick up again. But the PC, the amazing story is that the PC continued growing, and here we can see roughly what happened. Again, don't forget this is a log scale, so when you're growing in a line, it actually means you're growing exponentially. And the Macintosh was growing, it was 1.3 million by 1990, but the PC was more than 10 times. So each of these lines that you see horizontally is a factor of 10, so 10 times bigger. And next, after Steve Jobs left, Apple went and created NeXT computer, which, as you can see, was absolutely horrible performance, 12,000 units only. Just one of those happened to be the one that the World Wide Web was developed on. So it's actually still a very significant historic computer. But it was a terrible commercial product. The Apple II was fading already. It was still in the market, but it was fading by 1990. And most of the early incumbents, even Commodore, was fading at that point. So what happened is, basically by the mid-1990s, there really were only two left, and that was the PC and the Mac. And the PC was still growing. Here we have 33 million units a year, and the Mac at 3.8 million. And what happened by about 1997, it looked like it was all over for the Mac as well, because it began its decline. And the PC, the gap with the PC increased. And here you see 1.5 of these decades of amplitude difference by 1997. That was when everyone wrote the obituary for the Macintosh. However, it kind of didn't die, it stayed. The PC kept rising and the Mac sort of kind of came back. Here's the iMac, the effect of Steve Jobs' return. The iMac allowed the Mac to stay alive, but that's about all it did do. And the PC kept growing 120 million a year by 2000. And then finally, something magical happened. Nokia started selling what we call computers in the form of Symbian product. And there were only 500,000, but notice how much more its launch starting, it started launch with a launch of only 500,000 units, but that was a lot more than the early PC guys. And from then on, it actually grew so rapidly. And then came in RIM a few years later. Actually, they were still in, this was a kind of a fuzzy definition of a smartphone, but the RIM product was out there. And Nokia overtook Mac, and then RIM overtook Mac fairly soon after. And then we had the PC industry slowing down a little bit. And then in 2007 is when the iPhone and then the iPod Touch launched. And there you can see where their launching points were. And I'm just going to fast forward because it gets really ugly here at the end. And this is the situation today. It's a little bit fuzzy. I'm going to try to highlight some of these numbers, but we're at about 350 million. This is the end of 2012. 350 million PCs, but about 380 million Android devices. And so the Android platform has already overtaken the PC. The iPhone is still growing at 135 million a year in 2012. iPad close behind 65 million, and so on and so on. But what I want to draw your attention to is just how similar this looks to the early PC era. The fact that you had a large number of platforms, a large number of form factors, a lot of ideas in what computing was supposed to be in this new in the beginning it was called the personal era, and now the mobile era. And certainly some of these faded. In fact, already, as you can see back here, Nokia began to fade, RIM began to fade. Some never really got started, like Bada and the platform from BlackBerry's tablets. So in fact, we have a similar situation. The only difference is that everything is a couple of orders of magnitude higher. So the pattern of growth and decline is the same. Perhaps even the duration of the platform's lives are similar. But we did have two that extended far beyond their original pattern, and now we'll have to wait and see which of the leaders will stick around. So we'll go on and maybe illustrate a little bit more what might happen. So here's another way to look at it. Post-PC, here we're looking at units versus platform, the different types of mobile platforms, or computing platforms, sorry. And the units go all the way up to 350 million. There it is. So post-PC, what's been happening? I'm going to hit the play button here. And we can see, oops. Oh, there it goes. So this is Windows versus Mac starting in about 2000. And notice again the delta between them. This is not on the log scale. This is on the linear scale. In 2006 and 7, it really looks like a big difference. But then came the iPhone. And notice how quickly the iPhone has grown relative to the incumbent PCs. And then came Android, and then came the iPad. By 2011, 2012, this is the situation now. And actually, in 2013, we could put in some data, but I'm trying to keep things on the yearly level. The Android and already is overtaken Windows, and I believe the iPhone will as well, especially when you combine it as iOS with the iPad. And it has left far in the dust the Mac itself, which, although growing faster than Windows, has not been anywhere near competitive to the mobile platforms. So this is what we call post-PC, that the growth and the amplitude of growth are just so much higher than the computer industry was used to. And we'll get into some of the reasons why. Before we jump into that, though, I wanted to give you a perspective of the vendors as well, and the difference between different platforms as far as also their ownership and who are the players. So this is what I call cars versus trucks. The analogy coming from Steve Jobs, identifying the difference between tablets and PCs as one between somewhat casual use versus industrial strength. And to show this, I'm again showing by quarter now the units shipped, and these are in absolute units. So starting at 20 million at this line here, 40, 60, up to 80 million and above. And these are the vendors that you're all familiar with: HP, Acer, Dell, Lenovo, Asus, other PC vendors, and then Apple's platforms. Now, I'm not including phones. I'm only including computers and tablets. And so this is what the market looked like up until Apple's iPad launched. As you can see, there was a dip in 2009, and that was the worldwide recession due to the credit crisis. But we had a nice recovery in 2010, and the PC market actually rose to new heights on a quarterly basis, nearly 100 million units. The Mac, which is the red line over there, it's quite a small fragment of the whole picture, most of the others being Windows. But that is when the iPad launched here, which is in purple. I'll try to squeeze over it here. 3.2 million units in the first quarter. That was a big surprise. Nobody expected that this tablet will do as well as it did. In fact, because many people were dismissive of it as just a large iPod or a large iPhone. But it did very well, and in fact, it took a few quarters before competitors launched alternatives, and that was, for example, Samsung here in the first quarter of 11. And what I want you to focus on is this red line, which is actually where the red is the Mac, but above the Mac are going to be the tablets, and below it are going to be Windows. So it acts sort of what I call as a boundary layer between the two PC and post-PC worlds, the eras in history. So what happened is, if you look again at the red line, everything below it stagnated pretty much since 2010. We were below 100 million, and we're still below 100 million a quarter. But there was significant growth above the red line, and we're seeing that mostly as the iPad, increasingly more and more of the Android as well. And I just updated it with the latest quarterly data, which is available as of Q1, and this is where we are today, where the PC industry actually saw a contraction, depending on who you ask, is 14 or 11%, whether Gartner or IDC, but we've had one of the largest contractions ever into Q1. IDC said it was, in fact, the largest they've ever measured since 1994. And you can see how the original incumbents, HP, Acer, and Dell, are really somewhat shrunken from their previous state. And in fact, they are, HP sold half the computers that the iPad actually shipped. And we have in between the iPad, which is here, you can see it at about 19.5 million, and then the other Android tablets at another 17. So they're almost 50-50 right now. I used to keep also track of the Kindle, but it's not here because I just folded it into Android, even though it's not exactly the same thing. So what happened then is we had, and I've added Windows tablets, which are about 3 million units here. Again, my apologies that you can't see the exact numbers given the resolution here. I'm going to try to zoom in. So there's Windows tablets. As percent of overall tablets, this is how it looks. The blue area is the iPad, the yellow area is Android, and the red area is Windows tablets. And they're still growing in that sense. So what's the point? Again, it's that tablets have become a significant component of computing. There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to grow. In fact, I do believe that their computers, I'm using an iPad to present right now. It's actually a very capable presentation device. It's also a capable analysis device because everything that I'm doing on this device involves a lot of data. And this is actually previous generation, third generation iPad, and the newest are even better. So clearly it's in use in business, it's in use in education, it's used in certain verticals, but also it's growing rapidly as a consumption device, and so are PCs. Many of the PCs that are here, the usual suspects, are still used by individuals as merely entertainment products. So there's nothing shameful about doing your media consumption on a computer, and what we're seeing is a very healthy growth in the whole business of computing, although much of it, and most of it, in fact, is coming from the tablet space. And this is the same data now shown as a percent. It's more visible. Again, pay attention to the red areas, the boundary layer between, in terms of market share, adding up to 100, you can see how tablets now make up over a third of the computing market. Another way to look at it is that if you looked at PCs, and again, this is units in absolute numbers, so this is shipments on a yearly basis. In 2005, for example, the PC was about 200 million, and then it kept growing and growing. In 2007 is when the latest mobile revolution started. And here you see the line at the bottom representing mobile, and this is what it actually looks like since then. Tablets are here in yellow, and the addition of iPhone and Android now is well over 500 million units a year and growing. So that's the delta right now, and it's going to grow even higher because according to Google, over 1 billion people will be using Android by the end of this year. So the most, I would say 70% of Android users are on their first device and may have bought it in the last year. That's the situation for the computing market. And I want to take you very quickly now through what actually happened within the phone market, because even though we've had this devices that have taken over a lot of the consumption of computers, we've also had a tremendous turnover in the leadership of the phone market, and this is something that I felt personally. And using the same type of graph, I can show different market participants in the phone business. So let me highlight them for you here. We'll go one by one. So Samsung, obviously, we know that. Here's Nokia's, excluding smartphones. Here's Apple and ZTE, HTC, Motorola, Sony, and there'll be one or two other smaller players. So looking at the situation, again, starting the first quarter, I wanted to highlight is Q1 2007. You'll notice Apple began in Q2 2007 with 300,000 phones sold. And that's invisible in the scale, but there they were. And so compared to, for example, LG, Nokia smartphones at the time, 14.1 million. HTC, which oh, I didn't have data for them, sorry. But HTC, which much bigger player than Apple. Now, Apple is this 2.3 million here, and you'll see the thin blue line as it expands over time. Here it is in 2009. So what impresses the casual observer is that it actually, things look pretty steady for most of the market. Apple's market share as of Q1 2003 is only about 9% right now. It is, however, growing, and it has been growing since the very beginning of the iPhone. On a vendor basis, what's happened is that some of the smaller players, which are in the upper strata here, have shrunk tremendously, and that includes Nokia's smartphone group, which is now only 6.1 million, HTC, which is 5.5 million, and then there are some new players like ZTE and Huawei, which have grown significantly, and those are the yellow segments here. However, it does look like it's a fairly stable picture for the bulk of the market, which is Nokia's non-smartphone group, Samsung's overall division, and then other. However, when seen, this is the same data seen as a bar chart. I'm not going to go through it. It isn't particularly insightful, but you can see how it's changed over time. Samsung certainly has grown a lot. But the main thing is that the change has been in the smartphone segment. If you exclude the voice-only products or the voice-dominated products, the situation is far more dramatic. Notice also the growth that's happened between 2007 and 2010. Already the market has more than doubled by this point. And the player that's still dominant at that time, Nokia, 28.3 million units in that quarter. But what happened is, by Q1 2003, Samsung is by far the largest player. The interesting thing, though, is that Samsung was not a player in 2010. They had negligible market share in smartphones. So although we focus on the fact that Apple has come from nowhere, the truth is that also Samsung has come from nowhere in the phone market, and it did so in only 3 years. And Nokia and others have shrunk down to 6.1, as I pointed out earlier. So this yellow area here at the bottom is Samsung, and Apple is at 37.4. And some people discuss the situation with Apple as saying that Apple lost its dominant position with the rise of Samsung. Apple never had a dominant position. It only was the top seller of smartphones for 1 quarter during the whole duration of the market. So Samsung, what they did to make this 70 million possible is they switched over almost all their phone models from being low-end devices to being smartphones. And it's really that strategic shift they've done in their portfolio that actually caused this vast surge, because their overall phone business hasn't grown as fast as their smartphone business. They've simply been switching over. Nokia didn't do that, and for that reason, they actually declined, not only from being a great smartphone company, but also to actually losing their leadership position in all phones. There was a strategic decision made by Samsung early on, probably in 2008 or 9, to switch their portfolio over. And at the time, Nokia didn't think that the smartphone market would grow to become dominant. And I was there at the time. I recall it very well, as smartphones were seen as a niche. My hypothesis actually about why Samsung did this is because they were a supplier of components to other vendors. And the supply of chips to Apple, they would have had an order book which indicated that Apple felt that there was demand for a phone like the iPhone over in the hundreds of millions, and they had the orders early in advance. They had visibility, therefore, as a supplier, they had visibility into the market, which allowed their device group to commit to this new roadmap. So in terms of, these are the same data as lines, again, handset vendors versus the time frame here, is that we had Nokia. Here's Nokia's peak in Q4 2010. You might recall that in Q1 of 2011, the following quarter, is when it was actually in February that Nokia decided to switch from Symbian to an exclusive license of Windows Mobile, at the time Mobile, but renamed a Phone later. And Windows Phone was very much without friends, and indeed that caused the decline. As you can see here, Nokia declined dramatically and precipitously and was overtaken. Here's that moment when Apple was leading. You see that? So in fact, RIM there's a little bit flat line, there's RIM. Here's some other smaller players, LG, Motorola, ZTE, very small numbers at the time. So what happened is there's Samsung taking straight up, and then this is Apple, very much cyclical due to their product launch in the holiday cycle. Samsung, having dozens and dozens of smartphones, is much less susceptible to this volatility that Apple has to endure, because they have products that launch at different times of the year in different markets. So Samsung very, very much looking very good, though I think if you were to look at some of the fundamentals in terms of pricing and in terms of profitability, Apple is still by far the best. And then you have this clustering at the very bottom here, where everybody else is under 10 million. The only hope right now is that LG might break out. In fact, they had their first quarter where they had more than 10 million smartphones. And I think the bets, even I would have bet about 6 months ago, were that the Chinese, ZTE and Huawei, would actually grow to become the next big stories in mobile, but it hasn't happened yet. So this is the situation. Again, it's extremely volatile. We'll have to wait and see in another few quarters to see who's going to break out of this pack. There's still bets being made on BlackBerry. There's still bets being made on Windows Phone, especially as Nokia carries them forward. But so far, there hasn't been much activity here in the bottom. And of course, the big question is what is the rivalry between Samsung and Apple all about? And in a way, I think they're really quite asymmetric as competitors. Samsung, as I said, is a global phone giant who has been selling to all the operators in the world, whereas Apple still only sells to 250 operators out of 800 total. Apple has a very limited portfolio, really only one major product with a few leftovers, and one screen size as a result, and Samsung with a huge portfolio covering all the price points and all the distribution options. So it's a very different business, and these are chosen specifically because of their strategic planning that the companies have in terms of production capabilities and distribution. And ecosystems as well, Samsung not being particularly owning one, but Apple certainly very careful about maintaining a relationship with developers and thus keeping the screen size limited. So again, the same information now seen on a on the smartphone share basis. What is impressive again is Nokia. Here you can see Apple at 17%. This is again market share, adding up to 100 on a quarterly basis. And so back in 2007, if we go back a little bit here, it was very much Nokia leading, 49%, and Apple, when they started, had only 3%. But by the end of 2012 and early this year, we see a complete turnover where the purple area, which is Nokia, has abdicated almost everything to the entrants coming from below, which is Apple and Samsung. So Samsung, according to this data, would have 36% and Apple at 19%. The Apple peak was at 24% in the fourth quarter, so we had a slight contraction, but that's seasonal. Again, it may turn around yet further later on. And everybody else having roughly the same market share, 2 to 3%. Sony, ZTE, Nokia, RIM, and HTC. Motorola, hard to say what they're going to be doing. They're part of Google and not doing very well, actually. So one way to think about this picture is that we've had actually in this share of units, we've had really a far different picture than an overall phone business, where we've had one area being shifted from one vendor to the other. And if you looked at the same data, those were units. Here, revenues. Revenues for the whole market have grown, but again, it's primarily now Apple and Samsung that are dominant, $30.6 billion and $24 billion for Samsung, and everybody else not even equaling one of those giants right now. And this is through Q4. I haven't got the Q1 2013 data yet. But operating profit and seen as a percentage, this is the most dramatic storytelling I can do. This is showing that Nokia, for example, in 2007, Nokia had 60%. This is operating profit by quarter. And 60%, and Samsung was only at 11%. Now, what's impressive is just how the switchover happened. So what we are seeing here, again, let me try to zoom in to show you. 74% to Apple. Let me scroll down. 25%. This is again towards the end of Q4. 0% to everyone else. So this is just unbelievable. And the reason I'm so struck by this is because First of all, this is the largest technology business there is in terms of units, perhaps also in terms of revenue. This is a $250 billion business. And the largest technology industry, the most numerous of customer bases with over 1 billion people in using these types of devices and potentially growing much higher. And in the span of 5 years, you had a set of incumbents abdicating everything to a set of entrants that knew nothing and had no business being in this business. How is that possible? I think this is what the theory of disruption actually explains. It explains what causes this and how actually it's likely to happen yet again. And when we talk about disruption, it's an overused word, but this is the picture of disruption. It means that one area belonging to an incumbent is actually completely given over to a new set of competitors. And so Samsung and Apple are without any debate right now dominating the industry in terms of revenues, units, and especially in terms of profits. And will this situation change yet again? That is the question. So looking at a little bit at the forecast now about the future, I think before I get into some of the vendors and platforms, it's important to look at the overall how big the market is. This is millions of units by year, and it ranges up to a maximum of 2.2 at the very top here. 2.2, so let's say 2 billion is right there. 2 billion phones per year. And these are not just one estimate, but 3 estimates. Credit Suisse, which is here in blue, Gartner, and IDC. And the red line is actual, this was Nokia's measurement of the market that actually did happen. So somewhat these were a little bit higher for those years, but they continue to rise, and that's what the expectations are going into 2013. So in 2013, CS estimates that over 2 billion phones will be sold. And if we continue growing or going forward, by 2017, the number is 2.3 billion units a year. That's overall phones. It's not necessarily smartphones, but we're seeing a continuous growth here, well into above 2.2 billion units. Now, in terms of mix, here's what it looks like where the non-smart is green and the smart is blue. So we're seeing a split by 2017 where approximately 600 million non-smart devices, but 1.7 billion smart devices will be sold. So again, we've heard the same pitch that yes, the smartphone business is growing rapidly. This gives you an idea just how much that will be. 1.7 billion units by 2017, and even if we go back to 2013, it's about 1 billion. This is 976 million units of smart devices. Now, 20% of that, which is Apple has been around 17 to 20%. 20% is significant, right? It is even more significant when you're dealing with that many smartphones. So really, having a 20% share doesn't mean you're losing at all. In fact, having 20% share means you're probably going to have over 1 billion users if you preserve that share over time. And that is the interesting dynamic, which is different from the PC world. In the PC world, if you had small market share below a certain threshold, let's say below 30%, this is what Microsoft was thinking, that if they can take 70% share, they really might as well have 100%. There was this tipping point around 30% share where you lost all the developer support, you lost all your main customers, and companies like Adobe will no longer develop product for your platform. That's what was happening to the Macintosh. And so the problem is that in the mobile space, 20% means 1 billion users potentially. And so 20%, 1 billion users is about as many PC users as there are today. So think about it from that point of view, that since the market has gone up by a factor of 5 in consumption, the minimum threshold of 20% means you have 1 billion users. Apple right now has about 500 million, and it's not hard to envision them going to 1 billion. Android is going to get to 1 billion this year, and thus overtake the ecosystem of Microsoft in total. And yet Android and Apple together, being by far the most dominant players, where's that going to go in terms of having 5 billion consumers overall? I think it's easy to predict that not only is there room for these two players, but actually a third player with only 10% share can have a very significant market. And that's the bet being made by both BlackBerry and Microsoft right now. Microsoft themselves being dominant in one market with over 90% share, now yearning for 10% share in this market, and that 10% may be worth more than their 90% in the other one in terms of potential in the long term. And here we have the same data again seen as percentage, and 75% is the smart market as seen by Credit Suisse. Not a particularly, I would say, not a particularly aggressive forecast. Now usage in terms of the number of users, and I've been kicking these billions around and suggesting there are 5 billion people. Well, it turns out that in 2012, there are 5 billion users of connected devices, and that's what this number represents. And this is the number of smartphone users is right now expected to be about 1.7 billion people. And again, looking at, given all the sales data we have, this is what it would look like by 2017. Global smartphone users, 3.9 billion. Overall subscribers, 6.1 billion. So we're looking, because of the constant outgrowth of smartphones, we're looking at this split in usage by 2017. So again, although I say 5 billion, we're looking at about 4 in that time frame, 4 billion users by this estimate anyway. I think it's actually a little bit conservative. One reason and one thing to think about in terms of these technology transitions is that there comes a point in time in which you actually as a vendor will not make any more dumb phones. The analogy I like to think of is like when we had the switch from color TV to black and white TV to color TV. What happened was that many people were still happy watching TV on a black and white set, but they just couldn't buy one anymore, or they were discounted to be sort of just portable devices and not very big at all. And so vendors had no incentive at all to make these cheaper low-end products because all the margin was going to be on the high-end product. And that's why we're seeing Huawei and ZTE actually entrance in the phone business, making primarily smartphones and completely bypassing being dumb phone makers. And this is why Samsung now is at 60% of all phones it sells are smartphones, and it's on a very steep trajectory to reach 100%. So the number one vendor in the world, which is Samsung today, I think by 2017 will not be making any dumb phones at all. And Nokia is the only major player today actually still having a large part of their mix be non-smart. So I think they're going to tip over in shorter time than this, and we might see an acceleration in the smartphone business simply because it makes no sense. The economies of scale of smartphones will be so strong that it'll actually cost you more not to make one than to make one. And so that's potentially another thing to keep in mind, is that we just won't be able to buy any other type of phone. So if that's the case, then it's much more likely that this global smartphone will reach closer to 5 billion by 2017. That would be my expectation. And in terms of penetration, this is percentage. So again, percent by year, and the top is obviously 100%. The expectation is that globally, about 80% of people will be subscribers by 2015 of all the world's population, and smartphones will be 39. Just to check, in 2012, only 20% or so, 19% by the end of 2012 were smartphone users. That's expected to be 25% by the end of 2013, and again, about 50% by 2017. Again, keep in mind this is conservative, and it could accelerate quite a bit. And finally, a picture of the United States as a proxy of sort of where things might go more quickly. This is the US smartphone penetration is the top graph over here. It is showing a very steady increase. The dark area is smartphone users. The light area is non-smartphone users. It went over 50% in the United States, according to ComScore data, by about August of last year. Very predictable, actually visible even as early as 2009, because you can just draw this line on the graph and point to the month when it would happen, and it did happen as it was. And in fact, interesting thing is this bottom graph shows the number of new smartphone users on a weekly basis, and the black line is the trailing average over 4 periods of that data, and it shows how constant it was even after going over 50%, which happened somewhere a few 6 months before the end of this graph. And so what's happened is actually that there hasn't been any slowing in the number of smartphone additions in the United States, even after 50%, implying that we're nowhere near saturation, implying perhaps that even 80%, which was most people's idea of saturation, may not be the limit, and we might actually see this graph up at the top, the black area going to 100%. Notice also we're dealing with a time frame from December 2009 until the present. This is on a monthly basis, so very fine-grained data, and it actually shows how smooth the growth is, but also how fast, how it went from under 20% to well over 50% in only about 3 years. And that's the situation in the United States. I like studying this because we have data on a monthly basis, but secondly, the United States has actually been the leader in this adoption race. It wasn't the case in the mid-2000s where the US was lagging this adoption of smartphones because they didn't have the GSM standard across the United States, and most vendors didn't want to build 2 different types of phones. So Nokia, for example, didn't sell very many smartphones in the United States. So the US smartphone in about 2005 were 0, and Europe was already well above 10%. But that all changed with the iPhone, and since the iPhone, the US has been leading in smartphone adoption, and now as the largest region, it has the highest penetration. Europe is not far behind, but globally, again, the total is about 19%. The US, again, almost 60% right now. So I think it's a great early indicator of what will happen globally, and certainly the trend seems to be that there's no slowing beyond 50, 60%. In terms of growth. So just to wrap up now, a few words about ecosystems and where the race is going there. I wanted to show a picture in one snapshot of just how fast certain platforms have grown. And what I've chosen is the cumulative unit of a particular platform's users, the cumulative number after the launch. So this is a ramp, showing the ramp since the beginning of that platform. And so what we see, if you think about, this is also logarithmic scale, where the top of this graph is 1 billion users. 1 billion users, and horizontally we're measuring quarters post-launch, and I've actually sort of limited it to about 11 years worth of time. So what happened is, when you look at some of these some of these are actually game platforms like the Wii, mobile platforms like iMode, Android, and so on. But notice who the leaders are right now. iOS, after 18 quarters, iOS had 335 million. At the same time, Android had 614 million users. And on a log scale, these types of curves imply exponential growth, right? So they went in 18 quarters over half a billion users. And the question I had in my mind is, if you were to extrapolate these lines, how soon will they reach this threshold of 1 billion, and who's going to get there first? Well, obviously Android is ahead, but iOS isn't slowing yet. So it's still going now, 21 quarters, it's about 500 million. Notice how some of the others have slowed down and actually reached the end of life. There is one platform out there which has reached the 1 billion mark, and that is actually Facebook. And it took them 34 quarters to do so. Here's the iPod. Only after 10 years, it was only about 300 million total sold. And just at the very bottom of this, you'll see these gray dots. Those gray dots are the PC going back to 1981. And you can see again on this scale how much faster the mobile and the social have been relative to the PC era. So my expectation again is that Apple will reach 1 billion users. My expectation is that Android will reach at least 2 billion users. And the question is, what about the other 2 or 3 billion on top? I think it's very conservative to assume that we're going to see that split between these two and perhaps a third ecosystem as well. And Windows Phone is among them. It's actually well, no, that's Windows Mobile right there. But Windows Phone is actually growing rather well, but it is very early in the game still. So this is, by the way, the same data seen without a log scale. It's very hard to see the differences early on, but you can still see how steep the curves for Android and iOS are. And there's the red for Facebook. So basically, the way the iPhone has grown is also another interesting story, because iPhone has been, as I said, by generation, and I have tried to picture how many shipments each generation of iPhone. The first iPhone peaked at the rate of about 2.3 million a quarter. So this is what I'm showing here is the iPhone 1 and the quarter that it shipped. So by Christmas of 2007, the iPhone was going at the rate of 2.3 million a quarter. But then the next iPhone generation, the 3G, got off to 7 million a quarter on its peak. And then the iPhone 3GS and the iPhone 4. And finally, the iPhone 5, which peaked early on. And the problem, oh, sorry, that's 4S. I'm sorry, that's 4S. The iPhone 5 is this gray one here. And the interesting story there is that I think the reason a lot of people were pessimistic about Apple during the last 9 months is that it did not double like you saw the other previous generations. Now, I was one of the people that was very optimistic as well, because I had seen this pattern develop where it doubled every generation, was roughly selling twice. The peak was twice the previous generation. There are some aspects to the product which may not lend it to being that growth going forward. I'm also estimating, by the way, you'll see that the 4S actually took off after the 5 launched, because I felt that the dropping in the price allowed that to actually cannibalize somewhat the 5's success, something that didn't happen in previous generations. So I just wanted to bring this up as a story, and perhaps also as a warning that this particular product is targeted at a very premium segment and hasn't expanded, as I mentioned, the way Samsung has. And so there's been this somewhat disappointment that iPhone hasn't grown as rapidly as it should. In fact, in the last quarter, it grew only in single digits in terms of units. However, there's still a lot of opportunity for growth for Apple and the whole industry, because we're still not exploring all the possible form factors, all the possible input methods available. But having said that about Apple, I wanted to leave you with one more picture. And unfortunately, it's one that's very dense, but I'm going to try to zoom in and show you what I'm trying to represent here. These first row of graphs are revenues by segment of the major incumbent platforms, if you will. This is Google here, then Microsoft, here's Apple, here's Samsung, and here's Amazon. So at one glance, you can look at these since the beginning of the modern smartphone era, which means 2007. Look at the difference in performance of these players. Microsoft, which actually has grown rather handsomely for any company, looks very slow indeed. Google has grown, but not so much as Android itself. But Apple and Samsung are looking spectacular in this picture. And why is that? I believe because they're selling hardware, which is an integrated product today. Amazon has also grown, and it's the darling of Wall Street, but it isn't profitable. In fact, the way you can visualize profits is this second row, which is operating income. And there's Google, there's Microsoft, Apple, Samsung, and Amazon. However, as I said, Amazon is still quite a favorable company. or viewed very favorably because it has had this consistency of growth. And the problem with Apple has been, and again, why would you see that as a picture of failure? Well, Apple hasn't grown in the last quarter, hasn't grown year on year at all. In fact, it has slightly declined. I think the story for Apple right now is still one of what's going to come next, because the iPhone has reached probably peak growth. It's not peak units, but peak growth. And Apple needs to do something about broadening its portfolio. And again, comparing to Samsung, they are nearly at the same level, but Samsung is made up of a lot more businesses. As you can see, handsets, telecom, appliances, and so on. The gray area is the handset business and is by far the largest and the only source of significant growth right now. But these two giants, if you compare the capture of profits, by the way, yeah, this is an interesting story that Microsoft has a significant profit capture, not as much as Apple, but much more than Samsung and much more than Google and Amazon. And yet, Microsoft is not seen as a successful story in the marketplace. So in some ways, I guess the picture I'm painting is one of tremendous growth, but tremendous uncertainty at the same time. Even these companies which had all the skills and all this reputation for innovation as Microsoft and Google have had a very mixed picture in terms of profitability from this innovation. In fact, no one would have predicted, I think 5 years ago, that it would be Samsung that would capture as much as it did and splitting the market with Apple, both hardware-oriented companies, although making money very different ways. So in a sense, I challenge you to think about integration versus modularity as the primary dichotomy between these companies. One, the suppliers of components, as I see them, are these two, Google and Microsoft, ultimately are trying to sell either a platform or an ecosystem to their partners. And they have certain challenges. These companies here are actually integrators. They've built a whole widget, or if they've licensed something, they've licensed it very judiciously, as Samsung did, without paying out too much of the profits, unlike the PC vendors. And so the story so far in the first epoch of this mobile evolution has been that integration wins. It isn't a failure for the modules, but it isn't a great story either. And so as far as the market is concerned, a lot of people actually give credit to Amazon as an alternative method, where they're essentially saying that the product is not something you own, the device isn't something you own, but rather something that's used to a means to another end. So the innovation, perhaps in terms of model and business model, is actually deserving that Amazon deserves to receive that credit. And so we have within one picture here very diverse set of platform players, and we have a very diverse set of strategies. And I think the question in everyone's mind is, what's going to be the leading platform business model of the second half of this revolution? So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
You addressed the idea that the mobile market is much bigger than the desktop market ever was, and we might see more than two winners come out of it, and potentially Windows. Do you also see the possibility of another low-end player coming out of potentially the Chinese market?
I do. In fact, that's the bet being made, not just as a device maker. I think you're referring to platforms, right? So we have several players out there like Firefox, I think it's called the Finnish effort. I forgot the name. Jolla, and there are potentially ways of forking Android that have existed, like Tizen, and Samsung might be looking at something of their own. I think this is becoming an emerging topic for the vendors in that region. For political and other reasons, they don't like the influence that Google is exerting in this essentially 80% of the market that has grown around Android. And because the phone market is very, very much driven by operators essentially being the distributors. And operators are very cognizant of the political situation in their home countries. I think there's going to be a push towards finding a more indigenous solution to some of the platforms. However, practically from a developer's point of view, it may not be all that different, because I think all of those entrant platforms will have the web as their dominant targeted development platform. And so it will be very much an HTML5 type of solution there rather than native. So the challenge for a lot of the early entrants or early third-party alternatives like Palm OS has been, how do you develop an ecosystem where partners can actually target natively your platform? And they've had a hard time building, especially since I think Asian companies are not very well plugged into that whole ecosystem building process. Even Nokia had a hard time getting developers to stick with it. And so it's going to be an interesting evolution where one of the force vectors will be native versus HTML. And I think that's really going to favor more of these entrants. And we might actually see a lot more fragmentation around Android because of these different forks of it. Thank you.